You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're debating the issue of privatisation. A few days ago, the government announced that in the coming weeks, the Royal Mail will be floated on the London Stock Exchange, marking the biggest privatisation of a public sector company since the railways were sold off in the 1990s. A Sunday Times poll showed there's little appetite for the sale. An overwhelming 70% of respondents said they oppose it. But the government seems determined to push on. 3 decades on from Margaret Thatcher's vast programme of privatisation, we look back and evaluate whether it's worked. Are the railways better off in private hands? Are utility companies more efficient now they're accountable to shareholders? And will a private Royal Mail deliver? Joining me here in the studio are Nigel Hawkins, an analyst from the Adam Smith Institute and formerly political correspondent secretary to Lady Thatcher at Downing Street. Economist Keith Boyfield is a research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Christian Wolmar is a rail authority, journalist and author of On the Wrong Line, the story of rail privatisation. Finally, joining us on the phone is Neil Clark, a journalist and co-founder of the Campaign for Public Ownership. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me here at The Voice of Russia. I'd like to begin with Royal Mail. The company made a profit last year of £400 million and is now estimated to be worth $3 billion. But the government has had to bail out the company's pension deficit, costing the taxpayer £10 billion. So is the government doing the right thing by selling Royal Mail? Or is this cherished institution better off remaining in public hands? Nigel Hawkins, I'll start with you.
Overall, I think privatisation has been extremely good for many sectors of the economy, but there have been a number of failings. With regard to the privatisation of Royal Mail, I think it's going to be pretty successful. The company itself, as you rightly said, has had major transfers of pension fund liabilities, which remain in the public sector. But really, there's been massive underinvestment for years. It's not the most efficient organisation by a long way. And as we found with the telecom sector back in the early 1980s, when British Telecom was privatised, it should really give a real boost to the sector, and particularly, I think, with online, there are tremendous opportunities for the Royal Mail if they can really get their act together and drive forward the business with greater efficiency, much more customer focus. And remember, too, they do have probably the best customer book in the country, 29 million customers, which is a record and something they can really use.
Neil Clark, do you want to respond to that then?
Well, I think it's absolute nonsense what Nigel said. I don't know where he's been since 1979. Privatisation's been good. I think everything that's been privatised has been an absolute disaster for customers and for the British public. The railways, let's take the railways, we pay the highest train fares in Europe by a country mile. Water, again, some of the highest bills in Europe. Same with gas and electric. We've been ripped off in a massive way, and it's going to be the same with the Royal Mail. Nobody wants this except outside of the City of London and the rich backers of the Conservative Party. People aren't marching in the streets calling for the privatisation of the Royal Mail, are they? Because people are happy with the Royal Mail. It's done a great job. It's been in public hands since 1516, 500 years. And even Margaret Thatcher, who was the queen of privatisation, if you like, even she didn't want to privatise the Royal Mail. Even she knew it would be crazy to do so. We've got a very good service which people are happy with. Why privatise? And I think that we've still got time to stop this, because supporters of privatisation can't really point to one privatisation that's been a great success. Every privatisation, we've had the same thing: higher prices for consumers, worse service, cuts in services. It's going to be the same with the Royal Mail. We'll be losing our universal delivery. We'll be using our 6-day delivery service. And we've got to try to do all we can to stop this before it goes through.
Does anybody want to pick up on that point that nobody can name a privatisation that has been a great success?
I think Neil Clark has been living on the planet Zog for the last 30 years.
No, I think you have, Nigel.
It's absolutely horrifying when you look.
You travel by rail. We've got the highest rail fares in Europe, 10 times more than the rest of Europe.
I mean, if you want to subsidise the railways to the extent that the Italians do and others, if you actually look at this issue about the popularity of privatisation, it's quite true that I don't think any privatisation measure since 1979 has actually been popular before the privatisation measures were taken. But I think you'd find very few people, apart from Neil Clark, who would be in favour of renationalising the airports or British Airways or British Steel or many of the other things.
Those are easy examples. There's a lot of people who'd want to reprivatise water, electricity. Look at the mess that electricity generation is in. We don't know where our power is going to come from.
I would argue that's because of government intervention on not allowing the market to work.
It's quite the opposite. It's the fact that private companies can only see short-term interest. They can't look at the 30, 60-year kind of scope that you need for something like electricity generation. So it's easy. Yes, of course, airports are probably best privatised, although there's an argument there. But certainly electricity, gas, water have not sat happily in the private sector.
Can I quickly respond to that? There is a view, and I suspect Christian believes in this. They believe that state planners, politicians, can plan better than the market, and that is the reason why some of these industries should be taken into public ownership. But it is still very much the fundamental issue, for example, with railways, where the government should intervene to plan these things. I would just say one last thing on that, and that is that politicians, whether they're members of the Labour Party or Conservative Party, the one thing that they have in common is their lack of experience of running any business. And I find it curious that people who argue in favour of public ownership would want to have a whole bunch of politicians whose main experience seems to have been as lobbyists or public relations men, David Cameron being a good example, to actually run these very large enterprises.
Nobody says that the politicians should run these enterprises. These enterprises should be run for public benefit, but by people who are expert. British Rail is a very good example of that.
I will come to British Rail in just 1 minute, Christian, but I want to go back to Neil Clark here. Neil Clark, did you want to respond?
Keith there is saying that our argument, that supporters of public ownership, are saying that politicians should run these industries. We're not saying that at all. British Rail was run by experts in the times when it was state-owned. So we want experts running these publicly owned industries. No one is saying that we want David Cameron or Miliband to be running the Royal Mail directly.
But these so-called experts were not allowed to run the industries. One of the justifications for privatisation is that ministers continually used to interfere in pricing and investment policies and a whole host of other things all through the 50s, 60s and 70s, which led to these colossal losses and also all sorts of industrial relations strife.
One can learn the lessons of that, right? One can learn the lessons and say, that's not a good way of running this industry. But that's a management issue. It's not an ownership issue. I think to make the case for privatisation, you have to say, what do these private companies bring to the party? And what they bring in is some capital, indeed, but at a great price. It costs an awful lot of money to pay for that capital, and they demand a higher rate of return than a government would. And therein is the nub of the problem.
But this, again, there are some people who argue, Christian, I suspect, that it would be a good idea to have these things under public ownership because you'd then get the government to invest in them. And that would carry a Treasury guarantee. But the problem of that is that the more that the taxpayer has to guarantee, it crowds out private sector investment. And one of the problems we had with nationalisation was that 10.5% of the gross domestic product of Britain in 1979 was actually represented by a underperforming nationalised sector, which was costing taxpayers huge amounts of money.
Keith, I would challenge that directly. That's the
You can read my book on it. I'll send you a copy.
It wasn't underperforming at all. We were performing very well. Which nationalised industry do you want to talk about?
Well, let's start with National Coal Board, British Steel. British Steel actually lost over £1 billion in 1981 and it was only kept going. It was bankrupt. It was kept going by the taxpayers. Network Rail, as I understand it at the moment, has debt of £27 billion, which effectively 30, has a Treasury guarantee.
30, but it's
even more horrifying.
It's notionally in the private sector. So
no, it isn't, because there's a Treasury guarantee backing it. And that means that you get a lower rate of interest, but that means that it crowds out private sector investment.
What does that mean, crowding out private sector?
Because more money is going in.
Let me blame that. But there's a real nonsense here. I've studied the rail industry for 20 years, right? There are no large private sector investors wanting to bang on the door and push out public sector investment. They're not there. They want a rate of return that is not obtainable on the railways. That is why the railways are not sitting happily in the private sector.
But isn't that the market signalling to you that you shouldn't invest in those things?
because the railways provide services that cannot actually be measured through the fare box. They provide all sorts of advantages which economists call externalities, such as reducing congestion, environmental benefits, access benefits, and so on, which you, as an economist, must well know about. And you can't get those through the fare box. People will not pay that money. Why should they? It's other people who are benefiting. So therefore, you need government involvement.
But sometimes, as Alan Walters, Mrs. Thatcher's economic advisor, used to point out, and a noted transport economist, I think it would have been cheaper to provide taxis to all the households on some railway lines.
Can I just challenge Keith on this very basic point? We're subsidising the privatised railways much more today, 4 to 5 times more than we did under British Rail. How can he answer that question?
Because in the last 10 years, particularly under Labour, you've seen far more government intervention.
No, that's why
the private sector has not been allowed to come up with innovative commercial strategies because they've been strapped.
We're giving money directly from the taxpayer to Richard Branson. No wonder he's always got a big grin on his face. I would if I was getting that amount of taxpayer subsidies. We're being hit twice because we're paying the highest rail fares in Europe by up to 10 times. And we're also subsidising our railways 4 times more than we're state-owned. You cannot make a case for the privatisation of the railways or the continued privatisation.
Nigel Hawkins, what's your response to this argument about privatising the railways?
I'm in favour of privatisation of the railways, unlike Christian. What I would say, though, is I think the way it was done was very stupid indeed. And I think to separate the national track from the operating companies was very stupid. The large number of legal agreements, the impact that's had on a massive bureaucracy in the industry. I actually rather prefer what they did in the water sector, where you have a few regional companies with really tough regulation, long-term capital investment programs that are set out, and the companies are required to perform. If you look at the water sector, for example, one of the great things where privatisation has made a major achievement is in delivering the investment in the water sector. Currently,
that's absolute nonsense,
guys. £4 billion a year is being invested in water and sewage. If you look
Thames Water sold off how many reservoirs was it? 70, 80 reservoirs. Incredible amount of water storage facilities have been sold off to property developers to build houses on. That's the investment that's going on. We're losing water storage facilities under privatisation. So that is complete nonsense what you just said.
If you look at the capital investment programme, look at Ofwat's figures, you'll find that about £4 billion per year is being invested. If you look pre-privatisation, particularly in the 70s, one of the first things cut was sewage investment. It was boring, it was unexciting, and the economy at that time was very short of money. So you will find that on water, investment has been very good.
Not true.
Well, we have to disagree on that. If you look at Ofwat's data, you'll find I'm right.
But that investment is not really coming from the private companies because it's been paid for by higher water bills. I mean, every time they want to make some investment, they go to the regulator. The regulator says, oh, yes, that could be added to your regulated asset base, and the bill payers have to cough up.
Oh, that's certainly true. In privatisation, in telecoms, you'll find prices have been cut substantially. In water, they have not.
Telecoms
prices
is another matter.
Have gone up
that's
in real terms very substantially since 1989. Yeah, water prices have gone up very substantially since 1989 in real terms, well over 50%, partly, and perhaps overwhelmingly, because the big capital investment programme.
I think in the first 2 or 3 years after privatisation, there was a massive rise.
I said 50% in real terms. That's quite chunky. That pays for the very big investment programme. You could argue, as I would, that the regulator, particularly in recent years, have been too generous to the companies. Severn Trent share price has gone up 10 times, roughly, since 1989, which you could argue is far too high. And if the regulators had been tougher, lower cost of capital assumptions, etc., it would have been a fairer share between the increase in price, which could be more modest, and returns for shareholders.
Isn't that an argument against privatisation then?
No, if the regulation is done properly, if particular assumptions on cost of capital are far more accurate than they've been, and you really organise it so that instead of the companies having the whip hand, the regulators have more of the whip hand, you can actually, in my view, run a successful industry, whether it's water, whether it's electricity, or whatever.
But this is very interesting because you've given 2 examples there where you say, well, I like the principle of privatisation, but in the railways it was done badly. In water, the regulators have not done their job properly and they've allowed the water companies to make excess profits. And is not that actually the problem? I mean, as I said earlier, what does privatisation bring? It's supposed to bring greater management expertise, which in some cases it has, and in some cases it hasn't. And it's supposed to bring private capital, but that private capital has to be paid for at a massive price. Why not allow the government to issue bonds, as they do in America, that great bastion of capitalism, fund major infrastructure projects, and therefore obtain the money pretty cheaply, and not go through all this upheaval of transferring assets to the private sector which belong in the public.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and I'm joined by Nigel Hawkins, an analyst from the Adam Smith Institute, Keith Boyfield, an economist at the Centre for Policy Studies, Christian Wolmar, an author and authority on British Rail, and Neil Clark, a journalist and co-founder of the Campaign for Public Ownership.
I'd just like to make a point about the experience of privatisation in the United Kingdom since 1979. And there's been a tension between how much competition should you bring into an industry and how far can you reap the maximum proceeds from the sale of those nationalised industries. Governments of all political persuasions found it more difficult to cut back on public expenditure than they did privatising state assets. And I think that that's something you've seen across the world in the last 10 to 20 years. Now, with the railways, there was a move again from the Centre for Policy Studies that you should try and separate the infrastructure, track and signalling, from the actual rolling stock and passenger trains. And the idea was that you'd get some element of contestability, competition into the railway sector. And I think that I might agree with Christian here that it's not been an overwhelming success.
Yes,
I would argue that what we need is more open access. But I think that that is a fundamental point which is worldwide, the tension between introducing competition into a sector in order to try and improve efficiency and actually government seeking to maximise the proceeds. I'd be interested in what Christian has to say about that.
I mean, my argument would be that there are some industries that are natural monopolies, and therefore they have to be stopped from exploiting their monopoly position. Now, one way of stopping them is to ensure they're in the public sector and then tightly controlled by, politicians and maybe even a regulator. There's no reason why you couldn't have a regulator of a nationalised industry. The point about railways is that they are fundamentally a natural monopoly. There's a limited number of train paths. And in fact, there's a great irony with the way that they have been privatised, because they've been privatised as franchises. In other words, a company gets the right to run services over a particular area, and they have certain obligations, first train, last train, and train frequencies and so on. And then the idea was that you then introduced competition in there, but you couldn't do that. And the government of the day, the major government, realised very early on that you couldn't try and let these franchises out and then tell these companies, oh, well, your best train, which is at 8 o'clock in the morning, there might be competition with somebody else running a slightly cheaper train at 5 to 8 in the morning, but they're not going to run all the other trains that you have to run at 10 o'clock at night, which are loss-making, and therefore there's a complete contradiction. So in a railway that is very crowded, that really has a very little excess capacity, there is no point and no potential to introduce competition.
Is there an argument then for renationalisation of the railways or for any other private company that used to be in public hands?
Well, there is a great irony here that actually, as Keith has alluded to some extent, the railways have been renationalised. The infrastructure company, which was Railtrack, is now Network Rail, has debts of, I have to correct you, it's actually £30 billion even more, £30 billion that are guaranteed by the government. It doesn't have shareholders, and it is effectively a state-run company. The only part, therefore, that is privatised is the rolling stock, which one could leave there, and the train operating franchises, which definitely could be brought back into the public sector. As Neil says, private companies make quite a lot of profit for absolutely no good reason. Profit generally is either a reward for taking risk, which they don't, or is a reward for capital investment, and they don't invest any capital. So why these entities are in the private sector is a mystery to me and to quite a lot of railway people I talk to.
Nigel Hawkins, what's your response?
Just the 2 quick points on that. I think the key determinant will actually be what happens to the East Coast main line this side of the general election. Do they decide to try and refranchise it out, given the Department of Transport's horror story of the West Coast main line situation? The Labour Party is generally thought, I think, possibly to want to keep the East Coast main line in the public sector if it were to win the next election. And secondly, outside the railway sector, was an element of renationalisation being introduced into the electricity industry through the back door. There's a real problem on getting investment for baseload generation. Every major plant since the 1990s of privatisation has been gas-fired. And at present, with all the uncertainties on electricity policy, etc., very little base load is being built. And I've always been rather negative about the potential for new nuclear to be delivered. There's major arguments at present going on the strike price between EDF and government. A figure something like £100 per megawatt hour is apparently wanted by EDF. Whether that actually gets built, I think, is getting pretty unlikely now. And frankly, the government may just have to react by either taking over the building of new nuclear build itself, by abandoning it, or getting much more involved in generation new build, which would be quite a reversal from what we saw back in the early 1990s.
That's a very interesting story you tell there, because are you therefore saying that it was wrong to privatise electricity generation? Or are you saying just again, as you've said about water and rail, that it was done the wrong way?
I've never said privatisation was perfect. I say for many sectors there were flaws. I think the major flaw for electricity was, first, it did nothing for new nuclear build. Back in 1990, it was felt that most of the new stations would be gas-fired, with a lot of independent gas-fired generation. Then, in just after 2000, without getting too technical, the new electricity trading arrangements were introduced, which had the effect, indirectly, of bankrupting British Energy and consolidating the whole electricity supply industry into 6 companies, 4 of which are overseas owned. And frankly, problems have flowed from that ever since. And I think it's one of the flaws of electricity privatisation. And one has to say, whether new nuclear build is ever delivered remains to be seen.
But this raises the whole point about one of the problems with privatisation, which, as I alluded to at the beginning, is that it's very difficult to get private companies to think beyond their shareholder value. And their shareholder value, they can think 5 years, they can think 10 years. They can't think 30 or 60 years. So therefore, is it not right, Keith, that long-term industries that require heavy capital investment, like the railways, like electricity generation, cannot really be successful in the private sector because of the short-term views, which have been even made more short-term in recent years in relation to their share value and so on?
I'm glad you raised that point, Christian, because I would argue that the worst thing about having politicians in charge of these things and industries accountable to politicians is that politicians are working on an electoral cycle, which is usually no more than 5 years. And industries and investors are very aware that Parliament can subsequently overrule agreements that have been made between governments and particular companies. And so I would argue that the worst thing you could do would be to nationalise these things, because you're then in go back to all the problems we had in the 50s, 60s and 70s of political intervention in these industries, which led to such a huge inefficiency and taxpayer losses and terrible industrial strife.
Neil Clark?
If we look at any kind of index, if we look at prices, if we look at employment, if we look at investment, the years from 1945 to 1979, the public sector industries, the nationalised industries, performed much, much better than their privatised successors have. And I think you can't really argue that point. I think everywhere...
I think that just about every economist I've ever met would argue with your view, Mr. Clark.
I'm defending the 1945 to 79 period because I think it was a great period. And ordinary people had a good time of things. The cake was shared around more evenly. You could get a train in the 60s and 70s. Walk-on fares were very, very cheap in real terms. Today, if you want to get a reasonable rail fare, you've got to book up months in advance on the computer. So we've lost that spontaneity. And I think the quality of life has gone down with privatisation. We're talking today all about investment figures, etc. What about the quality of life that's actually being reduced by privatisation?
Is there no argument, though, Neil, that efficiency has improved in some sectors? I mean, I've been told horror stories.
The railways are a disaster. I travel on the rail a lot in Europe, where the railways are publicly owned, and the efficiency of the railways in Europe puts ours to shame.
Putting the railways aside to one moment, though, isn't there an argument that there are some industries, like when I've been told horror stories of British Telecom taking months to install a home phone when it was publicly held? I mean, is there not any argument that efficiency, because these companies are now accountable to shareholders, has increased in some sectors?
No, because at the end of the day, all they care about is profit maximisation. All they care about is increasing dividends to shareholders. And I think that the experience that everyday people have with these privatised companies is often horrendous. With water companies, with gas companies overcharging, the customer service is appalling. The railways, we've got this almost like very, very, very poor customer relations now on the railways. If you get on the wrong train, we have stories of families who accidentally got on the wrong train and they've been fined heavily by the privatised railway company. Our whole sort of everyday life experience is worse today because we've got privatised utilities and privatised industries than it was in the days when these were publicly owned. The companies are much more grasping today. They're much more mercenary. They're much more callous in dealing with customers. So I think we all experience. I'm sure everybody listening to this program has had dealings with a privatised utility company, and they haven't enjoyed that dealing. So I think there's a quality of life argument here. If we get back to public ownership, and I would like to see all the industries sold off since 1979 brought back into public ownership, I think we would have so many benefits for ordinary people. The only people that would lose out would be the fat cats in the City of London.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're debating the issue of privatisation.
You haven't addressed the crucial point that I've made about the short-term views of these private companies. Now, you say politicians have short-term views, but nobody's saying that these companies should be run directly by politicians. We all agree they should be run by experts and who can take a long-term view. The whole problem is that as we've seen in various sectors like banking, for example, the private sector finds it very difficult to take a long-term view, and you haven't answered that point.
No, I think that the way to look at this is for these things to be determined by market forces. As Hayek told us, the market is simply an aggregation of individual wishes
market forces
on this.
And
actually, I would argue that if you look at energy, the way in which governments have intervened in the last 40, 50 years and the investment that we've put into loss-making sectors like the nuclear industry have been disastrous, and it would have been much better for the market to have been allowed to operate.
We're nearly out of time, so I'll give the final word to Nigel Hawkins.
Yes, getting back to Christian's point, I think there is a problem about long-term investment, and many city institutions admittedly are too short-term because they're judged on their performance from year to year rather than necessarily over 30 years. In one area, actually, which Christian does know a lot about, is High Speed 1, where I think I'm right in saying it was sold off, having been built for almost £6 billion to just under £2 billion on a 30-year lease to investment companies who said, yes, it's built, the risk is quite low, we're prepared to run it, essentially finance it for the next 30-odd years. So it can be done. And I think long-term it's going to be very important for major infrastructure projects to be far more accessible for long-term infrastructure funds.
I think the answer there is to try and involve pension funds and life insurance companies as funders of this long-term infrastructure. And that's something we've not quite managed to do.
They need to make a rate of return for their pensioners as well, though. That's the problem.
I'm going to stop everybody there. We could obviously keep going for quite a while, but that is all we have time for on The Voice of Russia today. I'd like to thank each of my guests. On the phone, we heard from Neil Clark, a journalist and co-founder of the Campaign for Public Ownership. In the studio, we were joined by Nigel Hawkins, an analyst from the Adam Smith Institute, Keith Boyfield, research fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies, and Christian Wolmar, rail authority and author. Thanks everyone for joining our debate here at the Voice of Russia studios in London. Next up is the news.